Okay, so welcome back to the second lecture on John Rawls. Last time I had taken you beyond the rainbow. Actually, I had taken you to the original position, which is behind the veil of ignorance for Rawls. We were trying to figure out how you could even start to reclaim the liberal tradition. And we moved to saying that there were problems with the liberal tradition because it wasn't actually a contract made between equal peoples, and if everybody's self-interested, we really need equals in order to set up a contract, and we aren't equals because of natural lotteries and social lotteries that we're involved in. And so, in order to get there, we need to do a kind of thought experiment where we forget all the particulars about ourselves, and that's the point at which we can then start thinking about justice. Okay, so now we have a little bit of a separate question. So all of that was setting up a place where we can think about justice more clearly. Now, the question we're going to take on in this episode is, what kind of account of justice would people accept from behind the veil of ignorance? Now, I've already given you one answer to that question, which is that people would in fact accept the inviolability of individuals, that all rational individuals are people with dignity and with at least a base set of rights. And so in this, Rawls differs already a little bit from Locke, in that Locke tried to start with individuals and then create justice, and Rawls says, no, you have to go the other way. We have to start with an account of justice, and then the inviolability of individuals is going to be a part of that. But what else would we be willing to accept behind the veil of ignorance? Well, Rawls puts forward his own account of justice, and he doesn't actually say that this is the only account of justice that people behind the veil of ignorance might accept. There are other accounts of justice that they might, although they would share significant qualities with his account of justice. He does think that his account of justice is at least one that meets all the requirements of a person behind the veil of ignorance. And his approach is called justice as fairness. And you can see even in that title how Rawls is different from the kind of positions that he's trying to break away from. So he's not Marxist. It's not justice as the fulfillment of all need. It is not utilitarian. It's not justice as the maximum amount of production, but it's something in between. It's justice as fairness. And in this process, Rawls is trying to put together a concern with increased overall production, because he thinks that, as a matter of fact, people behind the veil of ignorance will want increased overall production, but he also wants a concern for distribution internal to the society at the same time. So what does that look like? What is justice as fairness? Well, Rawls develops two, or we could say three. I'll say three. I'll go three for this lecture. I'll say three, although I'll show you how they could be considered two. So there's the liberty principle and then the equality principle, which you got to throw on at the end there. He talks about it sometimes as the liberty principle and the equality principle, which has two underlying principles. We'll just break it down. So we can talk about it as the liberty principle and then equality principle 1 and equality principle 2, or the open offices principle and the difference principle. So these are the standards that Rawls thinks that you would accept from behind the veil of ignorance. So let's say something more about them. Well, the liberty principle. So here it is. Each person engaged in an institution or affected by it has an equal right to the most extensive liberty compatible with the like liberty for all. And here he sounds distinctively Lockean, because he's all about that liberty, that doesn't work with the all about the base, but he's all about liberty, right? And in this, he sounds very much like Locke, and as a matter of fact, the principle is fairly Lockean. It says everybody has an equal right to the most extensive liberty until they start infringing upon the liberties of other people. Now, Rawls eventually, later on, did get a little bit more specific, because he says there's no such thing as kind of abstract liberty. There's particular liberties, like liberties to particular things. So he says there are these basic liberties which we ought to pay attention to, which is the freedom of thought, liberty of conscience, political liberties like representative democratic institutions that you have, and freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And then there's freedom of association, to get together with other people. Freedoms specified by the liberty and integrity of the person, that inviolability of the person, which means we can't make you a slave, or we couldn't make you a serf that works the land and simply works for what you get off the land. And we have to recognize freedom of movement and choice regarding occupation. So all of this is a set of kind of negative rights, very much in the Lockean tradition. Now note something that he didn't put amongst our basic rights, although it is something that he holds that we have a right to, which is a right to property. A member of a liberal society will in fact have an absolute right to some property. Every person has a right to their own personal property, inasmuch as that helps you develop yourself as an inviolable person and develop your own identity, etc. But in contrast to Locke, Rawls doesn't think that the right to property should be an unlimited right. And he specifies a couple of ways in which it's not unlimited at one point, so bear with me in my articulation of Rawlsian speak here. This right does not include the right to own the means of production and natural resources. Well, what does that mean? What's he going after there? Well, means of production might give you a clue. You have no right to be the owner of the means of production. If there is no inherent right to own corporations, for instance, or own particular industries. There's no right to own the labor of other people or the value that they produce. That's just not covered in your property rights. You have a right to private property, but you don't have a right to owning a corporation. But on the other side, he says, it doesn't include the right to participate in control of the means of production and natural resources, which are to be socially owned. So here he says, but also we don't want to go with a kind of more Marxist principle, which would say that, okay, so the means of production should be owned by everyone, should be owned communally. And he says, no, you don't have a right to that either. And what he's saying here is basically he's staking out a position between free market capitalism and communism. He's saying you do have property rights, but we're not going to cash these out in ways that devote us immediately to free market capitalism or communism. We're going to try and find a way between these two options. That means recognizing property in as much as people should have it to be truly dignified individuals, but not going beyond that, so that society has flexibility in exactly where they're going to put limits on people's property rights. Now, how did we end up so far from Locke when we started with Lockean principles? Well, I've already pointed out part of this is that Rawls thinks that we start with account of justice, which gives us the rights of individuals, rather than starting with the rights of individuals that then are put together in order to create an account of justice. But there's more to this going on. So Locke said that as an individual, you own yourself, you own your own liberty, you own your own labor, right? That's the basic Lockean system. Well, built into that is the claim that you own your own natural advantages. Because if it's the case that I own myself, I own my own freedom, whatever I do with my body, well, there we've gone. My body is mine. And that means that I own the fact that I'm taller or shorter than somebody else. It means that I own the fact that I have greater intellectual capabilities or not as great capabilities as somebody else. And I'm free to use those. And in a sense, whatever I do with those advantages and disadvantages is something I deserve. So if I'm taller and I pull down the higher apples on the tree, I deserve those apples. Now, you might be looking at me and you're like, you wouldn't be shorter than me, but I might be looking at somebody else and think, you don't deserve those apples, you just happen to be taller. Right? I mean, you don't deserve being taller than me. That's just the way you were born. You don't get that. That's not a moral claim over anything. And this is where Rawls wants to go with his social and natural lotteries. Well, it's the fact that some of us are born with particular advantages because of social or natural lotteries, that flip of the coin, then we have no moral claim to what we get from our own advantages or disadvantages. The claim that we deserve the superior character that enables us to make the effort to cultivate our talents is problematic. For such character depends in good part upon fortune, family, and social circumstances in early life for which we can claim no credit. So if it turns out that I'm a person with particular virtues that make me a good worker, that allow me even to get ahead, well, that's produced in part by the family that I came from. It's produced in part by those natural advantages that I had. And that's not anything that I have a moral claim over, because it was just an accident that I was born there and not somebody else. But if this is true, we're back to a fundamentally Aristotelian claim, which is the people who get to where they are in society get there in part on the basis of luck. So those who end up with greater power also end up with greater responsibility to pay it back into the society. You don't get ahead simply because you're a better person and so everything that you get is something you deserve. No, everybody ends up where they are in part on the basis of luck. And so, noblesse oblige, the more noble you are, the more you owe back. Or to take over from Spider-Man, the greater your power, the greater your responsibility. Who knew that Spider-Man was an Aristotelian? We'll come back to where this is effective when we get to Rawls's account of equality, but before we get there, I want to notice something else in Rawls' system, and something else that makes him somewhat of a liberal is that he prioritizes the first principle over the other principles. And as a matter of fact, he prioritizes so that he says the first principle is to be favored over the second principle, and the second principle is to be favored over the third. So the liberty principle comes first when you're thinking about morality. We shouldn't, in fact, invalidate people's basic rights, even if it helps with bringing about an equal or more fair distribution of goods in the society, right? But notice that he's also defined our rights in such a way that we don't have a limitless right to property, so it wouldn't really be violating our right to property so long as you didn't come and take away the property that I need in order to be a dignified person who develops my own identity. Okay, so the first equality principle is the principle of open offices. And this is the principle that you should never be put in a cubicle and separated from everybody else in the office as if you just have your little life there, because it's sad and it's alienating, and that's not actually what he means by open offices, although the open office, I don't like the open office. I would want a closed office. But not in Rawls' sense, because what he's worried about is equal access for people of different natural and social backgrounds in order to get into public offices or public jobs, anything that's like a government job or a public job in general. He's not making claims about like businesses and their ownership practices, although no doubt there would be something like this that he thinks should hold for them. This is not what he's talking about in particular. Here's this principle: that there should be an effectively equal chance to gain public office with any person of similar natural ability. right? So this says, right, there's an equal chance to gain office, but it's a little bit more than that. We have to focus on some of the key terms here. So he says there has to be an effectively equal chance to get a particular public office. And this means something more than simply a formally equal chance. So take, for instance, right, you and I have a formally equal chance with a millionaire of becoming president of the United States, because there's no law against us running for president, and so formally we're all possible people who could go up for president. But does that mean anybody could actually have an equal chance at the presidency? Well, no, because we don't all have an effectively equal chance. Why not? Well, one reason that we don't all have an effectively equal chance is that we don't have enough money, enough donors behind us to actually run for the presidency. In order to run for the presidency today, I think the last couple terms has taken about $1 billion to successfully run for the presidency. So this means that we've actually become more and more of an oligarchy, a kind of society that's ruled by fairly rich people. Unless you're rich, you don't have an effectively equal chance to run for president. Well, Rawls says that behind the veil of ignorance, we would call BS on this. We would say, no, this isn't the case. We, in fact, need an effectively equal chance to become president. And what does that mean? Well, we might imagine a system where there were public funds that got set aside, and that was how much people had to run for president. So there are public funds that allow you, like, there used to be this system, as a matter of fact, people used to use public matching funds in running for the presidency, but eventually the system just got so rich that you could make so much money on your own, you didn't need publicly matching funds, and everybody just went on past that. So Rawls is concerned about a society that uses some morally irrelevant category in order to figure out who's actually eligible for office. He says this ought not to be something that we just depend on who's rich, because the people who are rich are not necessarily the better leaders of society. Now, this is a point at which we can actually also bring into discussion the distinction between negative and positive rights. So thus far in the class, I've been using the term negative rights regularly, and I haven't really defined exactly what that is, although I've said that negative rights set me apart as an individual, and they tell other people to kind of get out of my way, right? So negative rights, for the most part, are rights that protect me from the interference of the government or other beings in my life, right? I'm protected from you coming and interfering with my own plans, my own values, my own thoughts, all of this stuff, my own conscience. You can't interfere with that. I have a negative right in that you can't interfere with that. So negative rights require you to get out of my way, and those are the only duties that they impose upon you or upon the society, is to not do something. But there's an entirely other set of rights that are positive rights that I might have, like rights to some good. Now, in some minimal sense, these rights have also existed in the liberal tradition up to now, because I have a right to a fair trial, for instance, right? So the state has an obligation to provide me with this good, to provide me objective judges, to provide me with a public defendant if I need it, even if I can't afford it, because I have a right to a fair trial. So positive rights provide goods to me, whereas negative rights stop you from interfering with me, if that makes sense. But as a matter of fact, as we get going and as the welfare state develops, we develop in the United States de facto a set of positive rights that go beyond what most of the liberal tradition imagined. So for instance, a right to education, or at least a basic education. So the state is obligated to provide a public education system which allows people to be educated, at least roughly equally with each other, right? And we go to where people have a right to at least some minimal form of existence, have food stamps, and have a right to be able to eat. Nobody should be starving, we think, in our society. At least that was the standard underneath the welfare state, that period from the 1940s to the 1980s. Well, here, Rawls's philosophy is actually helpful in articulating how this could make sense internal to a basically liberal system. Because he says, look, what we need is effectively equal opportunity at participation in our society, especially in those roles of leadership in our society. So we ought to have equal education, because people don't start out as an equal point, but we ought to bring them to be effectively equal with each other. This means providing them with certain goods. And this isn't illiberal, it isn't contrary to their own rights and liberties. As a matter of fact, we increase their liberties by providing them with positive rights. Well, having equal education allows people to have more choices about what they're going to do with their life. So it doesn't foreclose on their liberty, it actually opens up on their liberty. Having a kind of right to participation in your own society and all the goods that underwrite that participation doesn't end up making us less free, it ends up in some sense making us more free. Now, no doubt the libertarian, maybe the Lockean, will want to argue that this isn't really a just use of funds or whatever else because they want to focus more on property rights. But Rawls's system gives a justification for the welfare state, and actually a little bit beyond the welfare state, that was dominant in his own period of time and that had been so incredibly successful over the boom years of the American economy. So it seems like it's worth paying attention to. Now, if we go further in the open offices claim, so thus far we've been focusing on the claim that people ought to have an effectively equal opportunity to participate in public offices, there's a qualification on it, which is that everybody ought to have an equally effective opportunity with any other person of similar natural ability. Now, isn't this backing off on the positive rights claims that I was just making? Well, no, because Rawls actually thinks that at this point what we want to do is to maximize the effectiveness of our leadership positions. And he thinks that from behind the veil of ignorance, everyone will want to maximize the effectiveness of their leadership positions. We'll want people with greater natural abilities than people with lesser natural abilities. We'll want people who are more intelligent rather than less intelligent. Here he assumes that the rational person is going to be kind of more like Aristotle and Plato than the democratizing tendency which asks, who do I want to have a beer with when you figure out who's going to be president? And he says that this is in fact a justifiable move from behind the veil of ignorance, because the person with greater natural abilities will be able to organize the society and recognize, protect, and fulfill people's rights more effectively than somebody with lesser natural abilities. But the distinguishing feature here has to be natural abilities. It can't be anything else. So take, for instance, arguments about whether females ought to be firefighters, right? Rawls would just say that's the wrong argument to have. What we want to know is, do these people have equal natural abilities or unequal natural abilities? So we ought to have a test of the basic abilities that we want in a fire person, and we ought to have people take that test and see whether they pass it. It doesn't matter whether they're males or females, that's morally irrelevant, right? But what matters is, do they have the effective capacities to do this kind of thing? Now, this raises an interesting question about other areas, whether we should in fact have tests for people who want to be legislators or presidents of the United States. Should they be able to do things like spell and speak fluent sentences? Or should they, in fact, have a system of tests that they have to know something about the Constitution, something about law, right? Should everybody who runs for president have to pass some standard in order to qualify them, in order to do this? It's a fascinating idea, one that will never go anyplace, but a fascinating idea nonetheless, especially for those of us who are professors who would like to test everyone. So now we've gone through the first principle and the second principle, or the first equality principle. Let's go to the second equality principle, or the difference principle. Now this is the third in Rawls' order of principles, so this one can't interfere with either of the two above principles. The liberty principle comes first, then open offices, and then the difference principle. But this is the one that actually ends up being the most controversial, because this is Rawls' principle in order to figure out distributions of goods in the society. You remember that Rawls wanted to figure out how both to prioritize production somewhat, but not allow that emphasis on production to bring about unjust inequalities in the society. So how do you balance all of that out? Well, here's his solution, or his formula, which is endlessly argued about since then. Economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are to the advantage of everyone. And then he specifies, because he says everyone is too vague. You might think, oh, so this might be in the median person in the society, like we ought to help the middle class out or something like that. And he says, no, that's not everyone. He says, here's a good way you can figure out if everyone's actually being helped. He says, figure out if it helps the least advantaged of the society. So, in short, any inequality that you have in the society has to help those who are on the bottom end of the economic ladder. So, what does this mean in practice? Well, let's look at some examples to try and tease out some of what's at stake here. So imagine that we have two different societies, and they're distinguished by whether they in fact pay doctors more than they pay other people, or give some other form of rewards to people who become doctors instead of giving it to other people. Now this is significant because Rawls has built in here a kind of rational actor theory, which he assumes that people are egoist and that they're going to be motivated by more money. I don't know if you know about becoming a doctor, but it takes a significant amount of work, and people might not want to become doctors if you didn't pay them enough, or they might not want to become doctors who went out and served like the entire society. And so he says, well, here's the deal. Let's pay doctors a little bit more, and that will incentivize people to become doctors, and maybe we could pay them more for serving in high poverty areas. And so by having this inequality, it might actually help people. So let's imagine the society that just doesn't pay more and doesn't have doctors. Well, here you've got a remarkably equal society, an equal distribution of goods, but the distribution of goods is incredibly low. So Joe gets 1, Jane gets 2, Fred is dead, so 0, Ethel 1, right? So they're all pretty close to each other, but the total is 4. Okay, for the overall. Now you can't just pay attention to the total, you've also got to pay attention to the distribution, but this distribution is going to work out for everybody. So if we have a system where we have a doctor, we make somebody a doctor, so Ethel becomes a doctor in this system. As a matter of fact, we pay Ethel significantly more than we pay other people, but we also incentivize her going out to the society and helping other people and allowing everybody to get better. So Joe now is at a 6, 6 because, he's feeling better, he's more healthy. Jane's at a 3, Fred's at a 4, and Ethel's at an 8. Well, this society is not as equal as the one on the other side. It's not as egalitarian, but you know what? Everybody was helped by this inequality. It helped even the poorest members of society. Fred's not dead anymore, and that helps Fred out. So this is something that Rawls thinks that the person from behind the veil of ignorance would say, yes, we ought to allow a kind of inequality if we do this, right? Now note that if you didn't have the qualification that we pay doctors to go out to the impoverished, right? If we didn't pay doctors and incentivize them actually to go out to the poor in society, they might not agree with it. So our system doesn't exactly match up with the system that Rawls might like better. Let's take an example that might not work out as well, although as with everything with Rawls, we could actually argue about this because it's an abstract principle. So take NFL players. So NFL players, even more than doctors, at least your average doctor, make an obscenely great amount of money, right? And so they make a huge amount of money, and the question that Rawls wants us to ask is, does this inequality, the amount that they make, actually help those who are the least off in society, or help them enough to justify the inequality of the amount of money that these people make? And so here I've got two different scenarios. So we take the one from the society that had doctors, but we'll assume that there aren't NFL players in it. So there's Joe and Jane and Fred and Ethel, and it's 6, 3, 4, 8, so they have 21. Well, if we go over to the other side, let's say that Fred becomes an NFL player who makes this outrageously huge amount of money, right? But in the process, there's a lot more money going to him that gets kind of siphoned out of money that other people could have or that could be set for other purposes in the society. So as this goes, Fred becomes, way ahead of everybody else in the society. Everybody else basically loses 1 point in order to provide Fred with the amount that he's getting. Well, this produces an overall greater number if we just think about production in the society. So it's a 34. The utilitarian would be like, yeah, go with that. But Rawls might say, look, no, actually, having this inequality in society actually made those who were on the bottom end worse off than they were before. Now, I don't want to say that this actually is immediately the case. I mean, the presence of the NFL in society, produces jobs. And maybe it's the case that, like, Jane could get a job, like, in the NFL that's, picking up trash after the games or whatever else. And it could actually have a net positive effect, but then we still have to ask if it's a net positive effect that justifies the inequality. I mean, could you be paying the players less and still have that effect of increasing the goods for everyone in the society? Let's take one more example, which I'm not going to break out into alternate societies and act as if we know enough to sort this out perfectly, but let's say the case of the CEO, the head of a company, the person who's in charge as opposed to your run-of-the-line workers. Is the pay that the CEO gets justified? Does it bring about an increase in the goods of everyone in the company or the society? If we look at CEO pay over time from the 1980s, about the time of the decline of the welfare state, by no accident, CEO's pay tends to escalate dramatically in comparison to the average worker in the company. So the worker is actually not even the light green line, but the dark green line there that just stays basically at the bottom, stable the entire time. But the CEO keeps making more and more money. And you might wonder why. Why are they in fact making this more and more money if it doesn't actually affect other people? We might say that, oh, well, you know what, though, the company's producing a lot more. Or we might say, well, it's actually serving the people who are the stockholders in the company. They make more money, right? Well, but Rawls says that a person from behind the veil of ignorance who doesn't know whether they're going to be one of the few CEOs or stockholders or whether they're going to be one of the many laborers would in fact look at this and say, no, that's just. They would say, well, okay, it's producing more for those people, but what about the people who are the actual laborers? Shouldn't they be sharing in this overall rise in the goods of society? So what does this look like in application? Well, it looks like a mixed government, very much what developed in the United States under the welfare state, although Rawls would actually say that the welfare state falls somewhat short in bringing about what he thought the society should look like. He thought that the ideal form of government and economics would be, in fact, what he called like a property-owning democracy or a socialist democracy, something in there. But basically, what he has in mind is a mixed government and a mixed economy. So a government that is democratically run, but that controls some elements of the economy, especially things like providing for the welfare, those positive rights of the individuals, and doing what's necessary in order to bring about more fair distribution of goods in the society. So certainly his state has a place for what we would call progressive taxation, a kind of tax that would put a heavier burden on the people who make more money in society, and that distributes that in ways to the people who have less money in the society. Rawls wouldn't see this as a violation of the basic rights of anyone in the society, because he says, no, what you have a right to is that basic property necessary in order to make you a dignified individual. But by the time we get to the upper echelons of the economy in the United States, you have well past that amount of property. And besides that, you don't deserve everything that you've gotten. Things that you've gotten have in part come to you on the basis of a social and natural lottery. So they were given to you without being something you deserve, and you owe them back into the society to help people who didn't do as well in the natural and social lottery as you did. All right, so let's close up by putting Rawls in touch with the themes for our class. Human nature. Now, it's important to say that Rawls himself would not want to claim that he's putting forward a kind of robust human nature, because what he's really interested in is the thing that all human beings share apart from their particularities, right? So he wants to avoid giving you an account that fits with any comprehensive account of the human being. He doesn't want to give you anything like Aristotle's account of eudaimonia, which gave you the set of practices that led to human fulfillment. He thinks that maybe as a Christian or as an Aristotelian, you'll develop that for yourself. But that's then yours, and you get to pursue that, right? So he thinks that the picture of human nature that he develops is something that all reasonable people will be able to agree on that they're a part of. And in this process, he draws on rational decision-making theory, which actually puts him in touch with a far more robust moral psychology than I think he wants to admit, but I'm going to stop at that point and just say humans are rationally self-interested, capable of reasoning to standards of justice in abstraction from their particular identity, right? So, I mean, basically, we are kinds of egoists, and we have advantages and disadvantages that come from the natural and social lotteries, but if we abstract ourselves, we're able to think about justice if we just go to the extra mental work to do it. Social or individual? Well, the individual is prior to the good of society, and they have innate dignity and rights. But we have to remember that we recognize that that's the quality of the individual when we're behind the veil of ignorance. So it's not the case that individual rights come before justice. Justice comes before individuality, but in a just system, we recognize the inviolability of the individual. People and property. Individuals have a right to private property, but there's limits on their right. The right that they have to property is a right to the property necessary to allow them to develop into a dignified individual who is able to develop their own plans and think about themselves as an individual. But beyond that, it's going to depend upon the particular society and how they sort these things out. Equality or inequality? Well, individuals have different powers depending upon the natural and social lotteries. They do not deserve these different powers, however. Different powers just come to them randomly. So when they use those powers to get ahead, they actually end up owing other people back. Rational people will agree that all individuals have equal rights, and this includes both positive and negative rights. So I have the right not to be interfered with in pursuing my own individual plans, my own individual thoughts, but I also have positive rights. People have a right to equal education, for instance. The shape of government. Here, Rawls favors a democracy with a mixed economy. So the welfare state or something beyond it, probably even something beyond it, as Rawls imagined it. But as I said, he was kind of actually at the end of the heyday of the welfare state, so we've never gotten to see the development of anything beyond the welfare state. The purpose of government in Rawls' system is to protect the negative rights and provide for positive rights, ensuring that justice as fairness is implemented in the society. And what authorizes the leader for Rawls? Well, a social contract as would be agreed to by rationally self-interested individuals behind the veil of ignorance. Now, as an advocate for democracy, no doubt Rawls is going to say it should be the person who gets elected, but realize that ideally that would be the person who got elected from amongst the people who had an effectively equal chance at the office, which just doesn't exist in our society. So, in some sense, the leaders of the United States in Rawls' system are not really fully authorized to be leaders because it takes something more than simply the formal process of holding an election. You need a substantive democracy. You need something that doesn't just have the form of elections, but in fact reflects the rights of all the people. And Rawls doesn't think that American society actually lives up to that. Okay, so at this point I've represented Rawls as putting forward an account of justice that fits with the development of the welfare state, and in fact goes beyond the welfare state in being concerned deeply about racial and gender issues of justice, at least as those can be treated within a concern for liberal equality with each other. Rawls reinvigorated political philosophy in the United States and in Europe after this, and really remade the entire subject. But as I've also noted, Rawls sits at the end of the period of the heyday of the welfare state. But there was another figure who was living at the same time who started articulating principles for another approach to government that in fact would come to dominate the decades afterwards. More of a libertarian picture of government that pushes back against Rawls and seeks again to reassert the primacy of the individual above all else, including any account of justice. And so it's on to look at that, at Robert Nozick, and the philosophy that matches with a lot of what has happened in the last few decades of America. Okay, so come back to that next time. I will see you in the next lecture.